1982. The Fulda Gap. Above the forest of West Germany, the sky was clear. No contrails, no flares, no threats. On the Soviet radar screens, it was quiet, too quiet. A Warsaw Pact squadron was flying its standard patrol pattern, simulating interception of NATO forces. There had been no alerts, no breaches, and no detected intrusions. Then the kill tones started coming in. Within 5 minutes, 8 of the simulated Soviet fighters were dead. On radar, they had never seen the enemy. Their IFF systems hadn't registered any hostile presence. Their ground controllers had no warnings, no data, just red lights on exercise dashboards and silence on open channels. The attackers? They were F-15 Eagles, NATO's frontline interceptors. But these weren't ordinary fighters flying blind. They were being guided, step by step, by something the Soviets never saw, never tracked, and never planned for. 30,000 feet above the battlefield, orbiting beyond missile range, was an E-3 Sentry airborne warning and control system, AWACS. It didn't fire a single shot, but it killed them all. Inside the NATO command tent, American officers watched the intercept play out in real time. No guesswork, no delays. The AWACS relayed everything heading, altitude, target identity directly into the cockpits of F-15s. Soviet-style coordination was slow, centralized, and reactive. NATO's was agile, airborne, and surgical. And that difference had just turned a full squadron of Warsaw Pact fighters into simulated wreckage without a single one of them knowing what hit them. Across the border in East Germany, Soviet General Staff watched the reports come in from their observers embedded in the exercise. The after-action review was short. No system failures, no pilot error, no radar malfunction. They had simply been outmaneuvered by something they couldn't see and didn't understand. One advisor reportedly muttered, "We are flying blind," but they are not. This was no isolated drill. It was a preview of how the U.S. would fight every air war from that moment on, not with more pilots, but with more information. Not with brute force, but with eyes in the sky. And for the Soviet air defense complex, this was the first glimpse of a nightmare they couldn't shoot down. In the high-ceilinged war rooms of Soviet Air Defense Command, surrounded by glowing maps and static-filled radios, one doctrine had guided planning for decades: radar was king. The Soviet worldview was built on coverage, long-range surveillance arrays on the front lines, over-the-horizon systems pulsing out energy from deep within Soviet territory, networks of surface-to-air missile batteries, each tethered to their own tracking stations. The idea was simple. If the enemy flies, we will see them, and if we see them, we will destroy them. That assumption held steady throughout the 1960s and 1970s. It guided how fighters were deployed, how interceptors were scrambled, and how Soviet allies were trained. In East Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, Soviet advisors insisted that radar coverage and ground-controlled interception would be enough to outmaneuver any NATO aircraft. They had reasons to believe it. MiG-25s could reach Mach 2.8. S-75 and S-125 SAM systems blanketed the Warsaw Pact frontier. The P-14 Tall King radar could detect bombers at 600 kilometers. Soviet doctrine said the Americans may come, but we will see them coming. But that confidence had a fatal flaw. It assumed the enemy would fly the same kind of war aircraft, flying alone, dependent on limited onboard sensors, and relying on ground stations for direction. What Soviet commanders failed to anticipate was a completely different Model 1, where the battlefield was not controlled from the ground, but from the air itself. They hadn't imagined a flying command post orbiting above the conflict, seeing everything and controlling nothing less than the entire battle space. They hadn't anticipated AWACS. To Soviet analysts, it was too radical to work. a massive aircraft, slow, vulnerable, and expensive, an obvious target for missiles or fighters. It was written off as a luxury NATO couldn't afford in real combat. And besides, it wasn't armed. How dangerous could a radar plane be? So they ignored the signs. The U.S. wasn't just adding better sensors to jets. It was changing the way it fought wars. Instead of waiting for pilots to find targets, the targets were handed to them. Instead of interceptors being launched after enemy incursions, they were vectored into ambushes. And instead of losing precious seconds to human relays on the ground commands, flowed seamlessly from AWACS to cockpit. In Soviet war games, they trained for dogfights. In the real world, the Americans were training to kill you before you even knew they were near. That was the room of wrong assumptions, and it was about to be dismantled, one kill at a time. For decades, Soviet air doctrine emphasized centralized control. From the earliest Cold War years through the 1980s, every mission interception, defense, or patrol was tied to the assumption that orders would originate from the ground. Pilots flew where they were told when they were told. They engaged only after receiving command-level authorization, often from radar operators who saw only a fraction of the sky. This doctrine wasn't just habit. It was necessity, born from fear of chaos. The Soviet High Command believed decentralized decision-making in the cockpit would lead to confusion, friendly fire, or outright disobedience. So they built an entire warfighting structure designed to suppress autonomy. But in doing so, they made their fighters deaf, blind, and slow to act. American doctrine evolved in the opposite direction. While the Soviets focused on rigid control, the U.S. Air Force began investing in dynamic warfare pilots trained to think, not just obey. And the keystone of that revolution was airborne control. AWACS didn't just feed radar data to generals, it pushed real-time information directly to the cockpit. It liberated pilots from ground stations and placed decision-making power above the battlefield, where conditions changed by the second. In 1977, an E-3 Sentry joined a NATO war game in Western Europe. The results were immediate, and shocking kill ratios in favor of NATO forces skyrocketed. Interceptor response time dropped by over 40%. Simulated enemy aircraft were routinely ambushed before they even entered engagement range. Soviet observers dismissed the results as Western propaganda. But their own internal reports told a different story. Every year, Warsaw Pact exercises were increasingly skewed. NATO jets, guided from above, moved like predators. Soviet formations tied to lagging ground control looked like herds waiting to be slaughtered. And then came Afghanistan. The Soviets had gone in with MiG-23s and Su-17s. But without proper support from their own ground systems, in the harsh terrain, those jets flew blind. Western satellites watched as Soviet aircraft missed convoys, misidentified targets, and took losses they should have avoided. What NATO had already realized, the Soviets were just starting to fear speed wasn't enough. Firepower wasn't enough. Air superiority belonged to the side that saw first moved first and struck first. In this emerging reality, the Soviet doctrine of centralized control was a relic. A radar station could give you a piece of the picture. AWACS gave you the whole war. And every time a Warsaw Pact jet vanished from the sky without warning, it signaled something worse than a tactical defeat. It signaled that the very structure of Soviet aerial combat was collapsing from within. It happened during NATO's Reforger 1982 exercise, a routine war game that quickly turned into a tactical nightmare for Soviet observers. The scenario, a mock Warsaw Pact invasion across the Fulda Gap. NATO forces were tasked with repelling the advance using air power to blunt the assault. On paper, it was balanced. Dozens of fighters on each side, experienced crews, and simulated electronic warfare. But there was one difference. NATO had deployed an E-3 Sentry AWACS. The Warsaw Pact side had no equivalent. Within the first 2 hours of the exercise, the results were already lopsided. F-15 Eagles and F-4 Phantoms, guided by the AWACS from hundreds of kilometers behind the front, began engaging enemy aircraft well before visual range. Red Team fighters operating under Soviet-style ground control struggled to respond. Their radar operators on the ground couldn't see the full picture. Their pilots were flying blind, and by the time they received engagement vectors, the American jets were already behind them. In one simulated sortie, a 4-ship flight of F-15s took down an entire Soviet-modeled squadron without being detected. AWACS had identified the enemy's approach, calculated their likely bearing, and positioned the F-15s into the perfect kill corridor. Missiles were fired from beyond visual range. No Soviet jet ever saw their attacker. The exercise commanders noted the outcome with clinical detachment. Soviet-style tactics had failed. American dynamic command had dominated. But for the Soviet observers embedded in the war game, mostly intelligence officers and military advisors, the implications were devastating. This wasn't a fluke. This was an entirely new form of warfare, one where the first to see dictated the terms of engagement. The AWACS wasn't just a better radar. It was the air commander, the air traffic controller, and the air superiority multiplier all rolled into one flying brain. In the debrief, one NATO pilot simply said, "I didn't look for MiGs. I just went where the voice in my ear told me and pulled the trigger." For the Soviet delegation, that voice was the sound of their worst nightmare. AWACS had turned the air war into an ambush before the first missile even launched. Soviet analysts returned home in silence. They had just seen an impossible event fighters killing without ever being seen, and worse, without ever seeing the enemy themselves. It was, they admitted later in classified reports, not a battle. It was an execution. The classified debrief landed on the desks of the Soviet General Staff within days. A NATO exercise mundane on the surface had revealed something deeply unsettling. American fighters were scoring simulated kills at unprecedented ranges. Soviet-designed tactics, radar coverage, and command infrastructure had failed to produce a single effective counter. And at the center of it all was one critical node, the E-3 Sentry. But in Moscow, belief collided with ideology. Senior commanders at the PVO Strany, the Soviet Air Defense Forces, read the report and dismissed it as exaggeration. Some cited propaganda manipulation. Others claimed the Americans had cheated in the exercise by scripting the outcomes. A flying radar plane can't control an entire battle, one general scoffed. We've tested it. In theory, it's too slow to react, too vulnerable to missile attack, too exposed. What they couldn't admit, what the exercise had proven, was that those tests were outdated. In public, Soviet military journals doubled down. They described AWACS as a high-value target, an easy kill for interceptors and long-range SAMs. Articles in Vvenaya. Meisel claimed that in a real war, such aircraft would be hunted and destroyed before they could play any significant role. The phrase "big, slow, and blind without escort" became the party line. Behind closed doors, however, there was quiet panic. Soviet radar engineers pored over known specifications of the E-3 Sentry. They studied the range of its rotating radar dome, its ability to track hundreds of aircraft simultaneously, and most disturbing, its integration with NATO's digital data link systems, something the USSR still lacked. They found no immediate solution. The Soviet A-50 mainstay, developed as a response, was still in testing and lacked the software flexibility of the AWACS. Worse, their radar network was built for defense, not for projecting air power into enemy skies. AWACS wasn't just a sensor platform. It was a force multiplier that redefined offense. Still, the denials continued. One Politburo member allegedly joked that if NATO's AWACS was so powerful, they should rename it God's Eye. The military laughed nervously. In East Germany, Soviet advisors advised MiG crews to increase radar sweeps and remain on visual alert. But they offered no countermeasure, no doctrine change, no equipment upgrade. Just faith that the existing system, centralized command, radar-guided, interception mass formations would hold. It wouldn't. The Americans weren't just flying better jets. They were building a warfighting network, one that didn't wait for radar locks or ground orders. By refusing to believe what the exercise had shown, Moscow delayed the only thing that could have saved them adaptation. And the next time AWACS entered the skies, it wouldn't be in a game. It would be in war. When Soviet analysts finally conceded that AWACS might be a real threat, their response was shaped by a dangerous miscalculation. They believed the key to neutralizing it was firepower. The logic was simple. If AWACS guided the fighters, kill the AWACS. No radar plane, no guidance. They called it the decapitation strategy. Soviet air doctrine began outlining specialized missions in which long-range MiG-31s or Su-27s, supported by electronic warfare escorts, would seek out and destroy NATO's airborne command centers early in a conflict. It was a bold theory and a flawed one. First, AWACS platforms never operated alone. Every E-3 Sentry mission was surrounded by a protective shell of fighters flying combat air patrols. Beyond that, support from surface ships and long-range surveillance ensured that no Soviet aircraft could approach undetected. To even attempt a strike on an AWACS, Soviet pilots would first have to survive a gauntlet of American and NATO fighters operating with longer-range missiles, superior radar, and critically live data streamed from the very AWACS they were targeting. Second, the theory assumed AWACS was a bottleneck one, vulnerable link in a centralized system. But that wasn't how the Americans had built their network. AWACS was just one layer. If one aircraft was jammed, damaged, or destroyed, others could seamlessly fill the role. The architecture was modular, redundant, and adaptive. The Soviets, used to linear command structures, misunderstood what they were facing. They saw a single brain. What they were actually facing was a nervous system spread across satellites, ground stations, fighter data links, and sensor fusion systems. Worst of all, the Soviet military underestimated how fast the U.S. could evolve. While the USSR plotted theoretical ambushes on AWACS aircraft, the Americans were fielding J-STARS, expanding E-2C Hawkeye roles in the Navy, and moving toward a combat cloud model where every aircraft became a sensor and a shooter. By 1986, the AWACS model had been quietly shelved. Internal reports admitted that penetrating AWACS coverage was a near impossible task without air superiority, something the Soviet bloc had no way to achieve against the emerging NATO order of battle. The entire premise had been wrong. AWACS wasn't the weak link, it was the edge of the blade. And as one frustrated Soviet air doctrine officer admitted in a confidential memorandum, we do not face a plane, we face a system. And systems do not die from a single missile. When the kill the AWACS approach collapsed under its own tactical impossibility, Soviet planners pivoted to a new idea. If AWACS made fighters deadly by providing superior information, then Soviet aircraft could regain parity by denying that information. The new theory was built on electronic warfare, jamming, spoofing, and deception. If Soviet radar systems could blind the AWACS jam, its data links, or flood its radar screen with false targets, then maybe, just maybe, they could level the battlefield. At the heart of this hope was a family of Soviet electronic warfare platforms, the Il-22PP Porubchik, the MiG-25BM Wild Weasel variant, and later the Su-24MP Fencer F. These aircraft were equipped to target enemy radar emissions, disrupt airborne command frequencies, and degrade situational awareness from afar. Soviet engineers also invested heavily in ground-based jammers, massive truck-mounted arrays designed to flood entire sectors of airspace with electromagnetic interference. Codenamed Polena and Tamara, these systems promised to blind the high-flying AWACS radars long enough for MiGs to get through. And on paper, the math looked promising, until it didn't. In 1988, during a NATO red flag exercise, a simulated Soviet-style jamming network was deployed against AWACS-directed forces. The result was a complete failure. AWACS operators simply filtered out the noise-switched frequencies or used alternate sensor inputs. In multiple test runs, the AWACS retained over 90% tracking integrity, while enemy jammers were quickly pinpointed and eliminated. Soviet intelligence learned of these results through indirect channels, mostly intercepted communications and Allied reports, but it was enough to raise alarms. The second flaw in the theory emerged in real combat Iraq. During Operation Desert Storm, the U.S. faced a Soviet-trained air defense network. Baghdad's forces deployed Soviet-designed radars, interceptors, and jamming systems. They activated electronic countermeasures, flooded channels with noise, and tried to isolate AWACS assets. None of it worked. American AWACS aircraft continued to direct fighter engagements with pinpoint accuracy, often before Iraqi MiG pilots knew they were being tracked. SAM sites were neutralized systematically. Pilots flew with a level of awareness that no Soviet counterpart could match. And jamming systems, even at full power, only made them easier to locate and destroy. The second wrong theory had collapsed just as catastrophically as the first. Soviet war planners were forced to confront a devastating truth. American air dominance wasn't just about machines. It was about integration, speed, and resilience. AWACS didn't fight alone. It fought as the eye of a constantly evolving swarm. Every time the USSR tried to close the gap with hardware, America moved further ahead with software networks and doctrine. They weren't fighting an air force. They were fighting a new way of war. Soviet military intelligence, the GRU prided itself on knowing everything that flew, rolled, or floated under the NATO banner. From tank schematics to radar arrays, GRU analysts had built detailed profiles of nearly every piece of Western hardware. But AWACS, that system had always eluded them. Part of the problem was conceptual. Soviet analysts could identify the E-3 Sentry as a modified Boeing 707 airframe with a spinning radar dome. They knew its radar Westinghouse AN/APY-1, later APY-2, operated in the S-band and had a theoretical detection range of over 250 miles. But they failed to understand how that raw hardware transformed into a battlefield brain. They saw the platform, but not the paradigm. Western sources were more evasive than usual. Satellite images showed the aircraft on runways. Comment revealed call signs, flight schedules, even refueling patterns. But the real function of AWACS was hidden in the invisible handshake between aircraft, the encrypted data links, the real-time coordination, the prioritization algorithms that fused radar, satellite, and SIGINT inputs into a coherent battle plan. In short, the Soviets knew what AWACS was, but not what it could do. One former Soviet Air Force officer later admitted, "We saw the radar. We saw the plane, but we didn't understand the language it was speaking to the fighters." The GRU attempted to infiltrate NATO AWACS crews with little success. A few intelligence-gathering missions near AWACS patrol zones yielded signals, but they lacked context. American signal encryption was simply too advanced, constantly evolving. ELINT aircraft like the IL-20M would pick up radar sweeps, then return home with pages of data that translated into nothing actionable. The CIA, meanwhile, was feeding a stream of deliberate disinformation into Soviet channels. Fake technical reports, staged conversations, and scrambled flight logs misled GRU officers into believing AWACS had critical vulnerabilities, radar blind spots, tracking delays, software faults. Dozens of pages of Soviet analysis were based on data planted by American counterintelligence. That failure wasn't just operational, it was doctrinal. Because Soviet planners, misled by flawed intelligence, continued to invest in systems designed to attack the AWACS as if it were a centralized node, they never realized it was a distributed nervous system. The ultimate proof of the intelligence failure came in the first Gulf War. Despite knowing AWACS would be deployed, Iraq's Soviet-trained defense forces had no countermeasure. Not a single one. No decoys, no coordinated jamming, no strike plans. They had radars. They had fighters. But they had no way to fight an enemy that saw them before they saw anything. In the post-war GRU assessment, the verdict was damning. We did not underestimate the technology. We misunderstood the doctrine. And for a command that built its empire on knowing what the enemy would do before it happened, that was the most dangerous failure of all. For decades, Soviet military theory rested on the idea of overwhelming force, armies in depth, waves of tanks, massed artillery. In the air, the doctrine was no different interceptor regiments backed by ground control radar stations, linking layers of national airspace and missile systems, waiting to catch any breach. But by the late 1980s, the United States had abandoned that same logic. It had replaced bulk with brains. And nowhere was that transformation clearer than in the skies. AWACS wasn't just a flying radar. It was the capstone of a revolutionary combat architecture. At its heart was real-time data fusion. The E-3 Sentry gathered radar returns from hundreds of miles away and instantly linked that data with satellites, SIENT platforms, JSTARS surveillance planes, and fighter aircraft. That data was filtered, prioritized, and distributed on encrypted channels to pilots, ground controllers, and naval units in seconds. It meant that a single radar contact picked up at the edge of the theater could trigger action from an F-15 100 miles away. No radio chatter, no delay. Just one updated target track blinking onto a pilot's HUD like magic. And the fighters themselves were no longer acting alone. Each F-15, F-16, or F-14 was now a node in a growing network, a mesh of sensors, shooters, and scouts. They received updates mid-flight, changed vectors based on live targeting from AWACS, and launched missiles at targets they never had to visually acquire. It was not a dogfight. It was a surgical ambush engineered by invisible hands. Behind it all was software. The Americans invested heavily in battle management systems like MCCIS and the Joint Tactical Information Distribution System, JTIDS. These tools eliminated latency. They let commanders retask assets in flight. They created common operational pictures that let everyone from pilots to generals see the same battle space unfold in real time. No Soviet system came close. On the ground, AWACS worked with NATO's IAD's integrated air defense system, coordinating not only offensive airstrikes but also defensive coverage. It could vector fighters to intercept incoming bombers, guide SEAD missions to destroy SAM sites, and trigger aerial refueling reroutes on the fly. The result: in exercises like Red Flag, NATO pilots, acting as defenders, were surviving longer. Those on the offensive were killing faster. Kill ratios exceeded 5-1. Mission success rates climbed into the 90% range. When Desert Storm began, those stats translated into real-world annihilation. Iraqi pilots trained in Soviet doctrine never stood a chance. They were flying into a kill web built by a flying command post they couldn't even detect. For the Soviets, it was a system beyond comprehension. Because it wasn't built on dominance through numbers, it was built on invisible coordination. One AWACS controller could command more effective airstrikes than an entire Soviet regiment. One E-3 could coordinate 3 airframes to kill 10 enemies, and it did so not through brute force, but through perfect timing, perfect information, and perfect trust between man and machine. In the end, the true American system wasn't a plane or a missile. It was a network of minds linked by technology unleashed in real time. The most lopsided air campaign of the modern era began on January 17, 1991. Operation Desert Storm opened not with thousands of planes crashing into battle, but with a whisper from 30,000 feet above the Persian Gulf. An E-3 Sentry AWACS called Yukon-01 initiated the first coordinated strike of the war. Its radar dome scanned the skies hundreds of miles deep into Iraqi airspace, locating hostile interceptors before they had even taken off. Within seconds, American F-15s were vectored to preemptively patrol kill zones. Iraqi MiG-29s, scrambling to intercept intruders, were picked off one after another. None of them ever saw what hit them. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. Over the next 11 days, AWACS orchestrated hundreds of airstrikes without a single aircraft lost to enemy fighters. Each sortie was fed targeting data before it even entered the threat zone. Strike packages flew with timing down to the second. Refueling aircraft, aid escorts, and combat patrols moved as if guided by a single brain. That brain floated quietly at 30,000 feet. Iraqi ground commanders, trained under Soviet doctrine, waited for patterns. They waited for signals that never came. Radar sites blinked online and were hit by HARM missiles within minutes. Surface-to-air missile batteries fired blind, unable to lock onto anything. And every time a squadron attempted to regroup or relocate, they were spotted, tracked, and erased before they could react. Captured Iraqi pilots later described the skies as haunted. One said, "We flew and we died. No warnings. No enemies on radar. Just fire." The Soviet advisors embedded with Iraq's air defense forces were equally stunned. These were the same networks that had been modeled after the USSR's prized integrated air defense system. These were the same radars, the same tactics, the same aircraft, yet every engagement ended the same way. The Americans saw everything. The Soviets realized too late that Desert Storm was not just a war, it was a demonstration. AWACS was not just a command platform. It was the nucleus of a doctrine that had bypassed the entire Soviet model of warfare. Instead of relying on overwhelming force, the U.S. had engineered overwhelming awareness. The numbers were brutal. Over 40 Iraqi aircraft shot down. Dozens more destroyed on the ground. In the air, the kill ratio was 30-0. AWACS-directed fighters intercepted and neutralized every attempt at resistance. Not a single AWACS aircraft was even fired upon. It was the final humiliation. A military system that had been designed to withstand NATO bombing raids had failed to detect the raids at all. The eyes of Baghdad were shut not by missiles, but by silence, and those eyes had been blinded by a fleet of aircraft that never once broke formation. When the reports reached Moscow, they didn't provoke debate. They provoked despair. Because for all the missiles, radars, and interceptors the Soviet Union had built, it had never built what the U.S. had launched that night, a perfectly connected war. In the wake of Desert Storm, the Soviet Union didn't just face the collapse of an ally, it faced the collapse of a world view. For decades, Soviet military doctrine had rested on 3 pillars: mass mobilization, layered defense, and centralized command. These principles shaped everything from tank divisions to fighter strategy. Victory in the Soviet mind came from superior numbers, tightly controlled operations, and discipline across the chain of command. But the AWACS campaign exposed a terrifying truth. None of that mattered anymore. What the Americans had built in the skies over Iraq wasn't just more advanced, it was a different species of warfare. AWACS didn't just enhance fighter performance, it made entire wings act like one organism. It dissolved the fog of war, it eliminated lag between detection and decision. It rendered Soviet-style command structures obsolete by decentralizing authority while centralizing awareness. Soviet planners realized that even their best systems, MiG-29's S-200 SAM sites, mobile radar units, were fighting in isolation. Each unit acted alone. Each relied on orders from above. By the time a radar locked onto a threat, it was already being jammed. By the time an order was given, the battle had moved on. And the worst part, the Americans weren't finished. In 1991, while Soviet doctrine was still processing AWACS, the U.S. was testing its next phase total battlespace integration. This meant not only airborne radar, but J-STARS for ground movement SIGINT aircraft, for intercepting enemy communications, and eventually satellites feeding live video directly into strike coordination centers. To Soviet generals raised in a system of silos and secrecy, it was unthinkable. How could the Americans trust pilots with that much data? How could they allow decentralized targeting? How could they react so fast without descending into chaos? They didn't realize the answer was cultural. America's military-industrial complex had fused innovation with doctrine. From the private sector to DARPA, from pilot training to software development, every level had been synchronized for speed, agility, and iteration. AWACS wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol of a military that trusted its operators to think, adapt, and act in real time. For the USSR, that was impossible. Trust was dangerous. Initiative was risky. Innovation without central control was heresy. So while America's kill ratios surged and its air campaigns grew cleaner and faster, the Soviet system buckled under its own rigidity. Budgets collapsed. Morale sank. Commanders questioned whether any future engagement with NATO air power could be winnable under current doctrine. And within months, the doctrine became irrelevant. Because in December 1991, as Moscow's red flags came down and the Soviet Union dissolved, one classified Air Force memo was quietly shelved in a drawer inside the Ministry of Defense. Its title, Limitations of Centralized Defense in the Age of Networked Air War. Its final sentence, we prepared to fight mass. They prepared to fight time. They won. Today, the AWACS platform still flies. It's been upgraded, refined, modernized, but that distinctive rotating radar dome mounted atop a Boeing 707 remains the same silhouette that once haunted the skies of Eastern Europe. In museums across Russia, Cold War veterans look at AWACS models with a mix of awe and resentment. Not because of the hardware, but because of what it represented. It was the ghost of a war the Soviets never expected to lose. The Cold War didn't end with a nuclear flash or a tank battle on the Fulda Gap. It ended with silent pulses of radar and streams of digital information. It ended with one side seeing and the other side guessing. It ended when the very foundation of Soviet air doctrine was rendered obsolete not by a new missile, but by a better question. What if we could see everything and strike before they even knew they were seen? That question changed the world. AWACS was the visible tip of an invisible revolution, real-time combat networks, sensor fusion, trust-based doctrine, and decentralized lethality. These ideas didn't just win the Gulf War, they reshaped the American way of war forever. but the ghost remains. In every modern conflict, the echoes of AWACS doctrine live on. In airborne command platforms guiding stealth fighters, in surveillance drones feeding data to satellites, in real-time targeting of enemies who never get the chance to fight back. Russia, now decades removed from the Soviet Union, has tried to rebuild. It fields new aircraft, newer radars, more digital tools. But the trauma of being blind in a battlefield of light still lingers. Every time an enemy vanishes from radar, every time a command post goes dark, every time a missile hits without warning, there's a ghost behind it. A dome in the sky, silent, watching. Because in the end, the Cold War was not just a contest of ideologies or arsenals. It was a race for sight.